The 19th century began in the shadow of one man, Napoleon Bonaparte. Rising from the chaos of the French Revolution, he crowned himself emperor in 1804 and spent the decade redrawing the map of Europe. His triumph at Austerlitz in 1805 cemented his legend, while the Battle of Trafalgar the same year saw Britain's Admiral Nelson destroy the French and Spanish fleets, securing Britain's dominance at sea. By 1806, Napoleon had dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, a political order that had lasted for centuries, proving just how much the old world was crumbling. Across the Atlantic, the United States made its own leap forward with the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. For just $15 million, President Thomas Jefferson doubled the size of the young republic. It was more than land. It was a vision of continental power, though one that would later intensify debates over slavery as settlers pushed westward. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, Haiti declared independence in 1804, becoming the first Black-led republic and a powerful symbol for enslaved people everywhere. The decade also witnessed the first major blow against the transatlantic slave trade. Britain outlawed the trade in 1807, a moral and political shift that would ripple worldwide. The United States followed with its own ban on imports in 1808, though slavery itself would continue to divide the nation. In science and industry, quiet revolutions were brewing. Alessandro Volta created the first electric battery in 1800, opening the door to modern electricity. John Dalton published his atomic theory in 1803, shaping the way we understand matter itself. Humphrey Davy isolated new elements, and in medicine, morphine was first extracted from opium, a breakthrough that would change pain relief forever. On the water, early steamboats hinted at a future where machines, not wind, would drive global transport. The 1800s were, in many ways, a prologue. Napoleon's wars broke apart centuries-old empires, while new nations and ideas began to take root. Scientific discoveries were laying the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution to accelerate, and the questions of freedom, empire, and expansion, raised in Haiti, America, and Britain's abolition law, would echo throughout the century to come. The second decade of the century was one of war, revolution, and natural disaster. At its heart stood Napoleon Bonaparte, still Europe's dominant figure. Yet by 1815, his empire had collapsed. After invading Russia in 1812, a disastrous campaign where winter and scorched earth tactics decimated his army, Napoleon's power began to unravel. The decisive blow came at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, where Britain's Duke of Wellington and Prussia's forces crushed him once and for all. Soon after, the Congress of Vienna redrew Europe's borders, aiming to restore balance and prevent revolutionary upheavals. Though monarchies were restored, the spirit of nationalism and liberalism unleashed during Napoleon's era could not be contained. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States fought its first major test since independence in the War of 1812 against Britain. Though neither side claimed outright victory, the war confirmed U.S. sovereignty and helped forge a stronger sense of national identity. On the Southern Front, Latin America erupted in revolution. Leaders like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín fought for independence from Spain, reshaping the map of the Americas. By the decade's end, much of South America had broken free from European colonial rule, setting a precedent for future anti-colonial movements. The decade also brought catastrophe on a planetary scale. In 1815, Mount Tambora erupted in Indonesia, the most powerful volcanic eruption in recorded history. The fallout created the year without a summer in 1816, plunging parts of Europe and North America into crop failure, famine, and social unrest. The crisis even had cultural consequences. A gloomy summer at Lake Geneva inspired Mary Shelley to begin writing Frankenstein, a story that reflected the anxieties of an uncertain age. Despite upheaval, progress pushed forward. Advances in industry and science continued quietly, while movements against slavery and for political reform spread further. But the 1810s were above all a turning point. Napoleon's fall, Latin America's independence, and Tambora's shadow marked it as a decade where old empires weakened, and new forces of nationalism, science, and even nature itself reshaped. The 1820s were a decade of revolutions. independence, and the early stirrings of modern industry. Europe, still reeling from the Napoleonic Wars, saw a wave of uprisings. In Spain, Italy, and Greece, liberal and nationalist movements challenged conservative monarchies. The Greek War of Independence began in 1821, a dramatic struggle that drew international sympathy and eventually succeeded with help from Britain, France, and Russia. It marked one of the first successful nationalist movements in Europe of the century, inspiring others to follow. Across the Atlantic, Latin America's independence revolutions reached their climax. Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín continued their campaigns, liberating countries like Peru and Bolivia, while Mexico achieved independence in 1821. By the middle of the decade, most of Spain's empire in the Americas had collapsed. This shift reshaped global trade, as the new republics tried to stabilize politically while European powers adjusted to losing vast colonial wealth. In the United States, the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 declared the Americas off-limits to European colonization. While initially just words, it signaled the U.S. intent to grow into a hemispheric power. At the same time, domestic divisions began to show. Debates over slavery deepened, foreshadowing conflicts to come. The decade also pushed forward culture and technology. Beethoven's late symphonies redefined classical music, while literature flourished with figures like Lord Byron, who even went to fight and die in Greece's independence war. Industrial change accelerated. Railways began spreading, with the Stockton and Darlington Railway in 1825, pioneering modern passenger train service in Britain. This was a quiet revolution. Railroads would soon shrink distances, fuel industry, and drive urbanization. Not all was progress. In 1825, Russia saw the Decembrist Revolt, where liberal-minded army officers attempted to block Nicholas I's rule. Though suppressed, it symbolized the growing tension between autocracy and reform that would haunt Russia throughout the century. By the decade's end, the world was unmistakably shifting. Old empires, Spain in the Americas, Ottoman control in Greece, were crumbling. New powers and new technologies were rising. The 1820s planted seeds of nationalism, industrialization, and American influence that would dominate the century to come. The 1830s were a decade of upheaval, reform, and the steady march of industrial change. In Europe, the spark came in France with the July Revolution of 1830, when the unpopular King Charles X was overthrown and replaced by Louis Philippe, the so-called Citizen King. This revolution inspired a wave of uprisings across the continent, from Belgium, which gained independence from the Netherlands in 1830, to Poland, where a doomed uprising against Russian rule was brutally suppressed. Nationalism and liberalism were on the rise, even as conservative monarchies fought to hold their ground. Britain avoided revolution, but underwent significant transformation. The Reform Act of 1832 expanded voting rights to sections of the middle class, a cautious step toward democracy. At the same time, the Chartist movement emerged later in the decade, demanding universal male suffrage and workers' rights. Britain also abolished slavery throughout its empire in 1833, a milestone in global human rights. Across the Atlantic, the United States was entering what became known as the Jacksonian era, marked by the populist presidency of Andrew Jackson. Democracy broadened for white men, while Native American communities were devastated by forced removal policies such as the Trail of Tears. At the same time, slavery expanded in the South, deepening sectional tensions that would eventually lead to civil war. In Latin America, the young republic struggled with political instability after independence. Meanwhile, Canada saw unrest in the rebellions of 1837 as reformers demanded more democratic governance, planting seeds for future self-rule. The Industrial Revolution accelerated throughout the 1830s. The expansion of railways transformed travel and trade in Britain, while factories powered by steam drove urbanization. These changes created both opportunity and misery, booming cities, but also harsh working conditions that fueled early labor movements. Culturally, the Romantic movement reached its peak, with figures like Victor Hugo, who published The Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1831, blending art with social commentary. Science also advanced, as Charles Darwin embarked on his famous voyage on the HMS Beagle in 1831, setting the stage for his groundbreaking theory of evolution. The 1830s were thus a decade where old monarchies wavered, democracy edged forward, industry transformed society, and new ideas in science, politics, and culture began to challenge traditional ways of thinking. The 1840s were a decade of revolution, famine, and rapid change. At its core was a crisis of old systems colliding with new forces, political, economic, and technological. In Europe, the decade ended with a bang. The revolutions of 1848, a wave of uprisings across France, Germany, Austria, and Italy. People demanded constitutions, democracy, and national self-determination. Though most of these revolts were suppressed, they revealed just how unstable the conservative order established at the Congress of Vienna had become. The revolutions also planted seeds. The spread of liberal and nationalist ideas would shape Europe's future. France, for example, saw its monarchy fall once again, replaced briefly by the Second Republic. Earlier in the decade, another calamity struck Europe: the Irish potato famine, 1845 to 1849. Caused by a devastating crop failure, the famine killed around 1 million people and forced another million to emigrate, many to the United States. It left lasting scars on Ireland, both demographic and political, fueling resentment toward British rule and shaping Irish nationalism for generations. Meanwhile, technology and science advanced at a dizzying pace. The telegraph, perfected in the 1840s, revolutionized communication, shrinking the world and laying the foundation for global networks. Photography also took off, changing how people documented their lives and history. In astronomy, the discovery of Neptune in 1846 expanded humanity's understanding of the solar system. On the global stage, the Opium Wars, 1839 to 1842, 1856 to 1860, between Britain and China began in this decade. The First War ended with the Treaty of Nanking, forcing China to open ports and cede Hong Kong to Britain. It marked the start of what China later called the Century of Humiliation, a turning point in East-West relations. In the United States, tensions continued to rise. The annexation of Texas and the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, extended U.S. territory to the Pacific, but also reignited fierce debates over slavery in new lands. Figures like Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists gained prominence during this time, pushing the slavery issue further into the national spotlight. The 1840s were turbulent, marked by revolt, famine, war, and scientific leaps. Old empires weakened, new nations stirred, and technologies emerged that would carry humanity into a more connected age. The 1850s were marked by upheaval across continents, wars, rebellions, and the growing shadow of civil conflict in America. In China, the Taiping Rebellion erupted in 1850, one of the deadliest civil wars in history. Led by Hong Xiuquan, who claimed to be the brother of Jesus Christ, the movement sought to overthrow the Qing dynasty and create a new religious state. The rebellion lasted over a decade and cost tens of millions of lives, leaving China weakened and vulnerable to outside powers. Meanwhile, the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, broke out between Russia and an alliance of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. Fought largely on the Crimean Peninsula, it exposed the decline of old powers and the need for military modernization. It also gave rise to modern battlefield medicine, with Florence Nightingale revolutionizing nursing and sanitation. Across the Atlantic, the United States was sliding closer to disaster. The Compromise of 1850 temporarily balanced tensions between free and slave states, but soon cracks showed. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854, allowed settlers to decide on slavery, leading to violent clashes known as Bleeding Kansas. The decade also saw the infamous Dred Scott decision, 1857, in which the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that African Americans could not be citizens. These events pushed the nation toward inevitable civil war. Elsewhere, Japan was forced to open its doors to the world. In 1853, U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry arrived with warships, demanding Japan trade with the West. This encounter shattered Japan's centuries of isolation and set in motion the reforms of the Meiji era. The 1850s also witnessed breakthroughs in technology and culture. The first oil well was drilled in Pennsylvania in 1859, foreshadowing the energy revolutions of the next century. In literature, Charles Dickens continued to define the Victorian age, while Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, forever changing how humanity understood life and evolution. The 1850s revealed a world in flux, empires clashing, nations boiling with internal tensions, and scientific ideas reshaping humanity's place in the universe. The stage was being set for the conflicts and transformations of the coming decades. The 1860s were defined by civil war, national unifications, and technological leaps that reshaped the modern world. In the United States, the decade opened with Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860, sparking secession by Southern states. This led to the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, the bloodiest conflict in U.S. history. It was a war over slavery and union, fought with modern weaponry but old tactics, leading to staggering casualties. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, reframed the war as a fight for freedom, laying the groundwork for the abolition of slavery. When the North finally triumphed in 1865, slavery was abolished, but Lincoln was assassinated days later. The Reconstruction era began, a turbulent effort to rebuild the South and integrate freed slaves into American society. Across the Atlantic, Europe saw the rise of new nation-states. In Italy, Giuseppe Garibaldi's campaigns completed much of the unification movement, culminating in the creation of the Kingdom of Italy in 1861. In Germany, Otto von Bismarck maneuvered Prussia into wars with Denmark, 1864, and Austria, 1866. Victories that paved the way for German unification under Prussian dominance. These movements would reshape Europe's power balance heading into the late century. Elsewhere, Japan entered a new era. The arrival of Western powers in the 1850s had destabilized the country, and by 1868, the Meiji Restoration overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate, restoring imperial rule. This launched Japan's rapid modernization, transforming it into a future world power. The decade was also marked by technological and scientific progress. The transatlantic telegraph cable, 1866, connected Europe and North America, shrinking communication time from weeks to minutes. In medicine, Joseph Lister introduced antiseptic surgery in 1867, revolutionizing healthcare and drastically reducing infections. Meanwhile, the discovery of dynamite by Alfred Nobel in 1867 provided both industrial uses and deadly potential for warfare. The 1860s were a turning point. Nations fractured and reformed. New states emerged, and technology brought the world closer together. By the decade's end, the map of the modern world looked dramatically different, and the forces unleashed would drive the conflicts and ambitions of the 20th century. The 1870s were a decade of nation-building, empire, and invention. Europe's balance of power shifted dramatically as Germany emerged onto the world stage. The Franco-Prussian War, 1870 to 1871, saw Otto von Bismarck's Prussia defeat France, capture Napoleon III, and proclaim the German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Germany's unification instantly made it a major power, altering European politics for decades. France, humiliated, turned to the Third Republic, while resentment toward Germany sowed the seeds of future conflict. Italy, too, continued its path toward unification, with Rome becoming its capital in 1871 after the withdrawal of French troops. Across the Atlantic, the United States recovered from the Civil War during the Reconstruction era, but deep racial tensions remained. At the same time, the Great Sioux War, 1876, highlighted the clash between U.S. expansion and Native American resistance with the famous Battle of the Little Bighorn, where Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse defeated General Custer's forces. Globally, empires expanded. Britain solidified its control in India, while the scramble for Africa began to take shape with explorers like Henry Morton Stanley, mapping the continent and paving the way for colonization. Japan, in the wake of the Meiji Restoration, fought and defeated samurai rebels in the Satsuma Rebellion, 1877, cementing its modernization and centralized state. The 1870s also marked an age of invention. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell patented the telephone, revolutionizing communication. Just a year later, Thomas Edison developed the phonograph, the first device to record and play back sound. By 1879, he had produced a practical electric light bulb, foreshadowing the electrification of daily life. Meanwhile, advances in steel production and railroads drove industrialization further. Culture and science thrived as well. In 1871, Charles Darwin published The Descent of Man, extending his evolutionary theory to humans, sparking intense debate. In the arts, Impressionist painters like Claude Monet began reshaping visual culture, challenging old traditions with new perspectives. The 1870s were thus a decade of transformation. New nations, rising empires, and inventions that would define modernity. Germany's rise, America's frontier wars, and breakthroughs in communication and science marked a world accelerating into the modern age. The 1880s were a decade of empire, industry, and cultural change. At the heart of it was the scramble for Africa. In 1884 to 85, the Berlin Conference, led by Germany's Otto von Bismarck, formalized the partition of Africa among European powers. Borders were drawn with little regard for local people, laying the foundation for decades of exploitation and conflict. The British expanded into Egypt, while King Leopold II of Belgium established brutal control over the Congo Free State, a regime infamous for forced labor and atrocities. In the United States, the frontier was closing. Native American resistance ended tragically with events like the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, just outside the decade. But the process accelerated during the 1880s as railroads and settlers spread west. Meanwhile, industrial tycoons rose to prominence. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil became the world's first great monopoly, symbolizing the new age of corporate power. His dominance of oil markets not only reshaped business practices, but also paved the way for the energy-driven 20th century. Alongside him were figures like Andrew Carnegie in steel, whose empires defined America's Gilded Age. Globally, technology and science raced ahead. Electricity began transforming daily life. Thomas Edison built the first electric power station in 1882, while innovations like electric trams and lights spread through cities. Communication advanced with improvements to the telephone and telegraph, shrinking the world further. Medicine also progressed. Robert Koch identified the bacteria behind tuberculosis in 1882, a breakthrough in understanding infectious disease. Culture reflected these shifts. Impressionism flourished in Europe with artists like Vincent van Gogh and Paul Gauguin, pushing boundaries of color and style. Literature also marked the decade. Fyodor Dostoevsky published The Brothers Karamazov in 1880, while Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, 1884, captured America's voice with humor and critique. The 1880s were also scarred by natural disaster. The eruption of Krakatoa in 1883 was one of the most violent in recorded history, sending shockwaves across the planet and altering global weather patterns for years. The decade epitomized modernization, ruthless imperialism, scientific discovery, corporate empires, and artistic revolutions. By its end, the world was more connected, more industrialized, and more unequal than ever before. The 1890s were a decade of endings and beginnings, the close of the 19th century and the dawn of the modern world. In the United States, the frontier era ended with the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890, where U.S. troops killed hundreds of Lakota Sioux, symbolizing the final suppression of Native American resistance. At the same time, industrial powerhouses like Rockefeller's Standard Oil and Carnegie's Steel Empire dominated the economy. The rise of trusts and monopolies created both unprecedented wealth and deep social inequality, sparking the beginnings of the progressive movement. Abroad, the U.S. emerged as a global power through the Spanish-American War, 1898. In just a few months, the United States defeated Spain, acquiring Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, while Cuba gained nominal independence. This marked America's arrival as an imperial power, with consequences stretching well into the 20th century. In Europe, old empires faced new challenges. The Dreyfus Affair in France, 1894 to 1906, exposed deep divisions over anti-Semitism and Republican ideals. Tensions in the Balkans and Africa hinted at conflicts to come while Britain reached the height of its empire. In South Africa, conflict brewed between the British and the Boer republics, setting the stage for the Boer War at the century's turn. The 1890s also saw scientific and technological breakthroughs that would shape the modern age. In 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen discovered X-rays, revolutionizing medicine. That same year, the Lumiere brothers debuted the first public film screening, launching the age of cinema. Nikola Tesla and Guglielmo Marconi pushed forward electrical innovation and radio communication, inventions that would define the 20th century. Culture thrived alongside science. Writers like Oscar Wilde, with The Picture of Dorian Gray, 1890, challenged Victorian morality, while Henrik Ibsen revolutionized theater with social realism. Artists such as Edvard Munch, whose The Scream, 1893, captured the anxieties of modern life, gave voice to a changing world. By the decade's end, the world was unmistakably modernizing. Empires expanded, science redefined human possibility, and the US joined Europe in shaping global affairs. The 1890s closed the century with the promise and the tension that would erupt in the 20th. That's the story of the 19th century. If you think this was dramatic, the 20th century took it all to another level with world wars, nuclear weapons, and global upheaval. So, if you enjoyed this, make sure to check out my video on the 20th century. It's even crazier. Thanks for watching. Hopefully, I'll see you in the next one.